Musical practice is often about solving problems. And when it comes to repertoire, they will bring their own unique problems to solve. So how do we solve a technical issue that comes across in a piece of repertoire without making the music sound practiced, sound robotic and mechanical? Well, the best way to do that is to be creative and come up with an exercise away from the piece of music that deals with the issue at hand. No pun intended. So let's get started by looking at how to create an exercise out of the piece of music you're working on. For this lesson, I'm going to use the piece Allegretto No.5 by Mauro Giuliani. It sounds like this. And on it goes. You can see that there's a lot of slurs happening in there, and that is one of the main challenges in this piece. If learning this piece, I would suggest just getting the notes under your fingers by taking out the slurs. So we're taking away one of the main challenges. And in that same time, we can take the slur challenges away from the piece of music and develop them as an exercise. So let's take the first one, for example. What's actually going on here? What makes this difficult? Well, the first thing is that we have a slur from the 5th string open to the C with the 4th finger. That's already a bit of a challenge because we all know the 4th finger is the least well-behaved of all fingers and it likes to do its own thing. So that's going to be a challenge of just getting accurate placement of that 4th finger. So already we have an exercise we can actually work with. And that might be simply an open string slurred to a 3rd fret with the 4th finger. We have one exercise there that works at the problem that we have in the piece of music without having to robotically repeat the passage, and that was the 4th finger slur, which is a challenge. So you can work on that. The next element in this passage that poses a challenge is the fact that we have what's called a fixed finger. We have a finger held down, in this case the A, while we do that slur. This makes the slur that much more challenging. So an exercise might look like this. And we could move it to another set of strings. These exercises might start sounding a little odd harmonically because we're going randomly between the different sets of strings, but it's nice to move across strings or perhaps up and down strings to give a bit of variety so we don't go completely crazy, staying in the same spot all the time. And it also gives us a way to partition our practice. We can do 4 on this pair of strings, 4 on that pair of strings, so on and so forth. Also, if we've, maybe not with this exercise so much, but moving up and down the fingerboard will change the difficulty. Sometimes things up higher are actually that much easier to work on because the frets are closer together. We'll find another example and see if we can use that. But that would be a good example there of measure 1, of how to make an exercise out of that challenging slur. Let's now look at measure 3. Here we have the challenge here is we're stretching on the 2nd string. So the challenge is the slur, of course, 4-2. Again, the 4th finger's giving us trouble. But we also have this stretch. We don't have any fixed fingers this time, but really it's just that stretch. So here I think is a good example of what I just mentioned. Going up higher on the fingerboard is going to make that stretch a bit more manageable. So we have built in our kind of challenge increments with the frets. So we can take this 4-2-1 stretch, we'll put it up, let's just say for clarity's sake, we'll put it up 5th fret, 7th fret, and 9th fret. You can move across the strings again. Back. In In general, as we go across strings, I like to keep to the inner strings as opposed to using the first string. And the reason is we can get away with a lot of different movements on the first string, both in the right hand and the left hand, where we don't really get held accountable. But playing on the second, third, fourth string, then we feel that first string there, and it is a little more challenging not to hit strings, not to make them sound, etc. So the inner strings are usually better for these types of exercises. Now, as I mentioned, as we creep down, the stretch is going to increase. So this could be an exercise all unto itself in your practice routine for a couple of weeks as we're developing this piece, because it's one of the hardest stretches in the piece of music. Developing that away from the piece of music means that when you get familiar with the notes, perhaps you took all the slows out to start off with, you come back to that measure, then it will be simply something that your hands have practiced already. So it's not going to be so much a pause in the music as you're playing. And if you struggle with a little passage like that, you can actually learn to pause and hesitate around those tricky bits, which we don't want in our final rendition of the music, of course. All right, let's see if we can find another example of something to practice. In measure 7, well, I'm going to stop talking for a second and I'll play through these 2 beats and see if you can identify, maybe you want to pause the video, see if you can identify what the challenging elements are here. So I'll play it again. So it's not a trick question. There's some pretty obvious things that are going on. So there's slurs. That's a slur. And once again, we have a held note on another string, so a fixed finger. We also have these little scale passages up top. So that might factor into our exercise as well. How can we make things easier and difficult so we can practice this away? So first of all, we have just the slur itself, that 4-1 slur. So we could practice that in isolation. Again, we mentioned going up higher might ease the challenge on the left hand. So you can practice up there in the 5th position. But the point is we're practicing our 4-1 slur, which is a challenging pairing of fingers. The next might be that we have a little scale passage with an open string, so we could do this. You can be quite creative coming up with these any of these exercise challenges. But the real kicker, so to speak, is this fixed finger. How do we make that easier and more difficult to amplify the challenge or make it easier on ourselves? Well, we've got the ability to move across the strings, but we can also move that fixed finger across the strings as well. So it's on the 3rd fret with the 3rd finger. How about we move that fixed finger over to the 3rd string? Sounds quite nice, actually. So what we've done is we've kept the same slur up the top, but we've just made it a little easier in terms of that gap. So instead of going up and down the fingerboard, making it easier and more difficult, we've gone across the strings. The gap is smaller. Then maybe we can move across to the 4th string. 5th string. That's exactly what it is in the piece of music, and we can make it harder than it needs to be. Going over to the 6th string and back. So you can see we're getting quite creative there, and it will address the issue. And when we come back to the music, we have that lovely feeling of, oh, I've already worked on this, so now I can focus on the musicality of the situation. Same principle applies to the 2nd beat here. But I would argue that this is even a bit more challenging. We have 2 fingers down. The 2 and the 4. Then the 1st finger slurs. So we could use the same principle. We could move the 2nd finger across, eases up that stretch. We could move across to the 6th string and back to the 5th. We could also remove one of the fingers that are fixed, so, or just the 2nd, or back to how it was. So I hope this is opening up some possibilities of what you can do in your pieces. It really is, there's not really a wrong answer here. You can be quite creative and inventive. You've come across hundreds of exercises, I'm sure, in different books. And the nice thing about these is they're very specific to the challenges that you might be coming up against or facing in a piece of repertoire that you're playing. So the first step is to identify what's the problem. Is there a problem? And the next step is to break that into the components. Okay, there's a slur, there's a scale, fragment, and there's a fixed finger. And then the third is coming up with a little exercise to deal with that. You can make it a little easier on your hand, you can make it a bit more difficult. And then bring it back to the piece, having practiced it in isolation, and enjoy the fact that you don't have to robotically and mechanically hammer away at these different passages within the music. Let's see how it goes. Nice one. See you next time.